Why do I need notes? I haven't read your speech yet.
No, I have.
I have a backup in case you said something totally empty. I have a backup.
Hello.
I have something backup, but I don't plan to use it. But if you hadn't shown up or something, somebody said, "Oh, give a talk."
Or you were ready.
Bob always has a talk ready. So.
Well, no, don't tell him. Maybe they'll decide to go for you instead of for him. Yeah.
Well, you got a nice crowd.
Well, you're a better judge than I am. Certainly a better crowd than I have chairing the General Assembly this meeting. With the routine.
More interesting. Sure.
Oh, don't shoot down my colleagues.
Like blackjack.
Oh, no, they're great people. Everything.
Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Star Auditorium. I'd like to welcome you here on behalf of the Canada Club and the Institute of Politics. Before we get started, there are a number of people that I would like to thank for helping to arrange this event this evening, and they are the officers at the Forum Office of the Institute of Politics, Melissa Liazos, who is chair of the Projects Committee at the Institute of Politics, Peter McConnon, who is president of the Canada Club, and especially Professor John Helliwell, who is the Mackenzie King visiting professor, and he's professor at the Center for International Affairs. Our moderator for this evening is Professor Brian Mandel, who is a visiting associate professor at the Center for International Affairs from the Norman Paterson School of Government in Canada, and Professor Robert Cohane, who is currently the Stanfield Professor of International Peace at the John F. Kennedy School, will be responding to the points raised by Ambassador Louise Frechette.
Not at the John F. Kennedy School, at the Faculty of Arts and Sciences.
Oh, sorry. There are no K-School grads here. Ambassador Louise Frechette was appointed to her current position as the permanent representative of Canada to the United Nations on January 6, 1992 by Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. In the past, she has served as Canada's ambassador to Argentina with concurrent accreditation to Uruguay and Paraguay, a post she held until August of 1988. She holds a Bachelor of Arts from the Collège Basile Moreau and did postgraduate work in economics at the College of Europe in Belgium. I would now like to turn this panel over to Professor Mandel to deliver the opening remarks.
Thank you. Thanks very much. What I see here tonight as my role as moderator is not to reintroduce the panelists, but to quickly lay out for you, I think, 3 or 4 questions that I hope will frame and bound some of the important discussion that we're going to have here tonight. It's a special privilege for me to have a Canadian ambassador here with us at the Kennedy School. While there are a number of Canadians throughout Harvard, we could certainly do with more, and it's a pleasure to have you with us. Where I want to begin is from a very personal perspective, and that's being Canadian and thinking about the UN. I grew up with and studied for many years the purposes, the nature, the role that the UN could play in the world, and always was intrigued that this was an important institution for Canada. So the first question I think that I want us to think about really is how we think about international institutions or international organizations in particular, a function of where we stand nationally and culturally. We are talking tonight about the United Nations in the context of an American university and an American institution, in the context of a culture that has had from time to time difficulties in its dealings with the United Nations. From a Canadian perspective, the UN has always been highly valued, always viewed as an important player in world politics, and a source of major collaborative problem solving. So I think that we want to think about where we come from, who we are, and what the UN means to us. And it's interesting to get American, Canadian, and other national perspectives on that. So what I would encourage you to think about that particular issue. That's as a Canadian, that's an identity question. As a person who studies international relations, I want to take a different take on this problem and ask the ambassador and Professor Cohane to think about the UN as an international organization from my perspective, which I'm currently viewing as being an international institution, currently being subjected to unprecedented stress. And the theme that I want to just relate for you for a few quick points, again, which I hope will address, is that when an institution is overburdened in terms of activities and obligations, does this compel us to rethink the original principles upon which the organization was founded? And to get right to the point, do we have to rethink the Charter's principles regarding sovereignty and intervention, and in turn rethink the notion of rights, duties, and obligations in international politics, such that we should be encouraging new forms of international behavior? Second, under conditions of institutional stress, and that I'm making the assumption that the organization is embattled to the extent that it has to cope with many problems simultaneously, is institutional reform the answer? We hear a lot these days about talking about expanding the Security Council to 15 or 20 members, creating a permanent standby peacekeeping force, or reconfiguring contributions to the UN budget. But my question is simply this: is institutional reform necessary or sufficient to promoting international order? Will it help to tinker with the UN if it ain't broke? And in particular, when we see an increased meshing of domestic and international politics between local, civil, and international society, what good might reforming the institution of the United Nations itself particularly do or be helpful? Third, I'm particularly interested in this organization insofar as it is trying to respond to a unique demand, an upsurge in multiple peacekeeping operations. And the question that I pose for us tonight is, what happens when we don't have the supply to meet this demand? Does this create a credibility gap in the multilateral bargain, where states are not willing to put up the support, the funding, the political and economic commitment necessary to sustain the kinds of operations and activities asked by the world's most important international organization? If they don't do that, will that in turn create a corrosive effect on international norms, creating an erosion of trust in international politics? That if we don't trust the UN, if we don't put forward our money and our commitments to peacekeeping, what is that saying about how states may or may not collaborate in a multilateral fashion? Last quick point. Fourth, and I hope at the heart of tonight's discussion, what I would like to call standing somewhere between the politics of hope and the politics of despair, is that what are the opportunities for organizations like the UN and other institutions as we make the transition from the Cold War order to some new international order? And would ask you to think about, are we asking too much of the UN in managing the burden of that transition? In conjunction with that, even as we see the UN strive to make these efforts in helping states and states helping the UN manage this transition, what opportunities are there for middle powers like Canada, like Norway, any other middle powers that you might think of, in getting a better handle on what the UN does and making a singular contribution that they couldn't do at other times during the Cold War? And thinking, since we're offering this presentation to you at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, are there opportunities here for U.S. foreign policy to strengthen the international organization regime, to strengthen the United Nations, and to play a very constructive multilateral role in international politics that I would argue has not always been the case in American foreign policy? So welcome to all of you. Welcome to our panelists. Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really very pleased to be here. I nearly didn't make it because of the storm, and for a minute I thought I was landing in Montreal rather than Boston. I'm really very pleased to see so many of you here. In fact, the attendance tonight is better than the one I had when I chaired the General Assembly this morning. And as Professor here said to me, it's going to be more interesting. Well, there's no doubt it's going to be more interesting. The session this morning was really, really boring. I thank you very much for your introduction and all the questions you've asked. I was much relieved to see that there's a lot of connections between your introduction and what I'm going to say, including your very first words, which are almost word for word what my first paragraph is. I will nevertheless read it as is to demonstrate that indeed Canada and the UN are almost inseparable. Canada has been a strong and consistent supporter of the United Nations. Indeed, particularly during the UN's darker decades, when the UN was largely powerless to intervene effectively in world affairs, and hence intensely unfashionable, Canadian foreign policy was to a large extent defined by its commitment to the UN. Not, of course, the UN as it then was, paralyzed by superpower confrontations and the politics of the veto, but rather the UN as envisaged in its charter, a document nearly 50 years old, of startling intelligence and clarity, which I commend to you highly. It's only in the past 5 years that the United Nations has started to explore in practice many of the provisions of the Charter and started testing its potential. The United Nations at the moment suffers from a confused image the world over. Coverage of the UN increasingly dominate front pages, but the news flashes contradict each other. For example, the UN peacefully shepherds Namibia to independence. The UN fails to settle the conflict in Angola. The UN holds successful elections in Cambodia. The UN is impotent to stop the killing in Bosnia. Is the UN the bankrupt organization that some pundits have already declared terminally ill? Or is it, on the contrary, gearing up to play an increasingly central role in world affairs? I will attempt in the next few minutes to chart a path through these conflicting signals and provide some perspective against which the news flashes can be assessed. Let me first offer a few observations based on my 2 years of day-to-day involvement with this most complex organization. The first is that the workload of the UN is not likely to diminish in the coming years. The fallout from the collapse of Cold War structures and certitude is still working itself out on the world stage. The disappearance of the imposed stabilities inherent in the superpower confrontation has freed pent-up ethnic and religious rivalries of a frightening intensity. The conflict in the former Yugoslavia is only the best-known example of this phenomenon. Many other nations, particularly in the former Soviet republics, also risk being engulfed in fratricidal wars. But the end of the Cold War has also opened prospects of reconciliation, as we've seen in El Salvador, Angola, Mozambique, and even in South Africa and in the Middle East. Most of these conflicts land on the UN's doorstep for two main reasons. The first is that no other organization has the scope of mandate, the expertise, the clout, and the moral authority that the UN has. Ideally, the UN should be able to farm out, so to speak, the Yugoslav crisis to European institutions and to leave the Haiti crisis entirely in the hands of the OAS. But until such time as regional organizations are better equipped to manage issues in their region, the UN will be drawn in. The second reason is that the sole remaining superpower now wishes to share the burden, moral and financial, of encouraging the peaceful resolution of international disputes and internal conflicts. Is the UN overstretched? It clearly is, judging by the visible exhaustion of key UN Secretariat units and of Security Council members now meeting on a daily basis. It is also evident in the increasing difficulty in recruiting troop contributors for new peacekeeping missions. Nevertheless, since there is no alternative to the UN, we shall have to adjust and learn how to adapt the organization to growing challenges. My second observation is that there is no rule book to guide the UN in this new era. Key foreign policy concepts which shaped most of my career, such as zones of influence and balance of terror, have been swept away. Others, such as the principle of non-intervention in the internal affairs of states and the central importance of sovereignty to international relations, are being revisited. Many member states of the UN are uncomfortable with the lack of precision or even clear definition of the new rules, some because they fear foreign intrusion in their own affairs, and others because they are concerned over soaring expectations of UN intervention to solve any and all conflicts. I doubt very much that the answer to these interrogations will come in the form of a formal renegotiation of the Charter or of attempts to legally define such new concepts as the right to humanitarian intervention or the limits to sovereignty. Decisions taken on a case-by-case basis are, however, creating a body of precedents which are shaping the normative environment of the future. The key to this evolutionary process is the support that the Security Council's decisions can command among the membership at large. It is significant to note that while member states may have questioned the means chosen to deal with certain issues, the legitimacy of its interventions has rarely been challenged. The very broad support among member states for the deployment of troops to Somalia with the right to use force, a very clear case of humanitarian intervention, and the imposition of mandatory sanctions to force the return of President Aristide to Haiti is very significant in this regard and shows how far the international community has come along in accepting a more interventionist UN. Indeed, there is as much, if not more, discontent over the lack of action than there is about fear of interventionism. Let me address in this context two frequently heard criticisms of the UN. One, that CNN dictates the UN agenda, and two, that the UN is applying double standards in its response to violations of international law. There can be no doubt that the global reach of the media helps produce some Security Council decisions which otherwise might not have been taken at all. Pressed by a public opinion mobilized by horrendous pictures on their television screens, the Security Council has often fallen victim of the do-something syndrome and has too often taken hasty decisions which it had not sufficiently thought through. The crises covered intensely by the media have also tended to receive priority attention, although the record will show that many unreported crises are also being attended to. I would only cite the example of Mozambique, where the UN is carrying out one of its largest peacekeeping missions, a fact little known by the general public. The question of double standards is delicate, complex, and of vital importance for the credibility of the UN. The Security Council must strive to act and to be seen to act consistently and equitably. The support of the UN's membership will fritter away if this basic requirement is not met. However, unlike a tribunal, the Security Council cannot simply apportion blame and lay down sentences. It must act in such a way as to facilitate the achievement of workable and durable solutions. A multitude of factors enter into their consideration, and no two cases are alike. The third observation is that just as there is no new rule book to define when and where the UN should act, there is no operational manual, so to speak, to guide its decision on how to intervene. Many of the crises confronting the international community are of a new sort. Because the UN was not allowed to act for much of its history, there are few applicable precedents to determine what will work and what will not. Rather, the response to each crisis is rightly defined by its specific characteristics. The concept of peacekeeping has evolved considerably over the recent years, and the UN is experimenting with new and more ambitious approaches. Peacekeeping missions followed the Suez pattern until a few years ago. UN soldiers would be deployed after a ceasefire agreement had been reached and with the full consent and cooperation of the parties involved. Although peacekeepers were often faced with delicate tasks of mediation and negotiations to help reduce tensions and resolve problems, the essential mandate of traditional peacekeeping missions was to monitor, observe, patrol, and report, with a view to keeping both sides to an agreement honest and help build confidence between them. This is not to say peacekeeping missions were ever risk-free. Ceasefire were occasionally breached, putting the UN soldiers interposed between the fighting forces in grave danger. This was the case on a couple of occasions in Cyprus and in the Middle East, for instance, as well as in the Congo, where the attempt to prevent the spread of a civil war nearly turned into a real disaster for UN forces. With the end of the Cold War, the door was suddenly opened to much more complex operations. Although no two peacekeeping missions are alike, many current or recently concluded peacekeeping missions involve not only monitoring a ceasefire agreement, but also supervising the disarming and cantonment of armed forces, organizing elections, training a police force and supervising its operations, setting up human rights institutions. This is the model followed in Mozambique, El Salvador, and Cambodia, for instance, where the UN even acted as a transitional authority until the installation of a democratically elected government. Typically in such operations, the UN is operating in a fairly permissive environment where active fighting has in effect stopped and cooperation from all the factions is generally forthcoming. Although in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge reneged on its commitment halfway through the mission and resumed military activity on a limited scale. These missions are often very large in size, over 20,000 in Cambodia, for instance, and involve not only military personnel but also a large number of police and civilians of dozens of nationalities. The decision to deploy UN troops to escort humanitarian convoys in Bosnia-Herzegovina opened a new chapter in the history of peacekeeping. Indeed, the word peacekeeping is hardly appropriate in this case, since there is obviously no peace to keep. The main task of UN troops is to provide support and a measure of protection to a vast humanitarian effort to bring food, fuel, and essential medicine to the civilian population. The UN force in Bosnia, until recently, used force only for self-defense. The shooting down of 4 Serbian planes in enforcement of the no-fly zone resolution and the NATO threat to use airstrikes around Sarajevo marked a new phase in the UN's operation in Bosnia. But given the limited number of troops available, a more systematic use of force would not be sustainable. Needless to say, the level of risk to UN soldiers has been much higher than in traditional peacekeeping missions, and there have been some instances of deliberate attacks against UN forces. I should also mention in passing that the territory of the former Yugoslavia was the theater of another innovation in UN intervention, with the preventive deployment of blue helmets in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. As for Somalia, I will simply recall that this is not a peacekeeping mission. Efforts to gain the agreement of the warring factions for the deployment of peacekeepers having failed, the Security Council authorized the use of force to ensure the delivery of humanitarian relief and help rebuild national institutions. Many of the more innovative UN ventures have been quite successful. I'm thinking here, for instance, of Cambodia, El Salvador, Mozambique so far. In others, Bosnia and Somalia in particular, the task has proved to be immensely more difficult than anticipated. My fourth observation is that as the UN tries to impose its authority and experiments with new forms of intervention, it will inevitably attract criticism and find itself embroiled in controversy. The world has turned to the UN for action, but to act means to risk failure. It also means to make choices that will, almost by definition, leave some people unhappy. By their very nature, the crises the UN is dealing with are not amenable to easy or rapid solutions. The peace processes the UN is supporting in Cambodia, El Salvador, and Mozambique are the result of complex negotiations and rest on fragile compromises that can be easily derailed, and setbacks are to be expected and have occurred. Each time, the UN must take the appropriate measures, a combination of carrots and sticks to get the process back on track. Success is not guaranteed, and criticism attends every delay. The problems we face in the territory of the former Yugoslavia are even more intractable. The UN's multifaceted efforts there have helped maintain a fragile ceasefire in Croatia, have brought some desperately needed relief to the population of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and sustained intensive negotiations aimed at finding a peaceful solution to the conflict. The presence of UN troops, as I believe, helped to contain the conflict and has constrained, to some extent at least, territorial acquisition and ethnic cleansing. Srebrenica is still a Muslim town today because 150 Canadian soldiers were deployed there by the UN to buttress the agreement negotiated with the Serbs not to overrun the besieged city. Meanwhile, the search for a comprehensive settlement continues. American more direct involvement in this process is, in the Canadian view, a most welcome development. Similarly, the situation in Somalia presents the UN with a formidable challenge. Feeding the hungry was the first priority, but unless a minimum of national cohesion can be forged to support the recreation of viable countrywide institutions, the prospects of a return to civil war, famine, and chaos will continue to loom on the horizon. Military intervention is not without its own risk, as experience in Somalia shows only too well. Many countries have vigorously argued that the UN has the right and the duty to intervene to protect human lives and to ensure decent patterns of behavior by governments. We are just beginning to realize what living up to such high standards can imply, not only putting significant resources at the disposal of the UN, but also putting the life of our soldiers at risk in combat situations. The challenges are daunting. Will the UN be up to the task? The answer to this question is obviously not a simple one. We should at the outset consider what being up to the task might mean. I'm reminded of a quote from Dag Hammarskjöld, who described the UN as an institution created, and I quote, "not in order to bring us to heaven, but in order to save us from hell." This in itself constitutes quite an ambitious program of action. The ability of the UN to preserve us from hell will depend on a variety of factors, of which several strike me as particularly important. The first, and doubtless the most important, is quite simply the political will of the member states. We should never overlook the fact that the UN is us, and that the UN will only undertake what its member states mandate it to do. If the UN appears hesitant in Bosnia, it is because its member states are cautious and divided among themselves over measures which should be considered. The active involvement and support of the major powers, first and foremost that of the United States, will remain of critical importance to the UN. It is no coincidence that the drafters of the Charter decided to grant to the major post-war powers permanent membership in the Security Council, together with veto power over its actions. They clearly understood that without the consent and support of the major powers, the scope for collective action would be very limited. The policy of the United States towards the United Nations has experienced a significant shift in the last few years. Washington has shown a greater disposition than in the past to favor multilateral action, and for the first time in its history, it placed several thousand troops under UN command in Somalia, as well as a few hundred in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. The debate over the scope of future American involvement in UN missions continues against the background of the sad experience in Somalia. The results of the administration's policy review on peacekeeping are awaited with great interest in New York, I can assure you. Some people argue that it is undesirable for big powers to participate in peacekeeping, which should be left to more neutral countries. It must be recognized, however, that only the bigger countries have the capabilities required to support the kinds of operations the UN is now conducting. The United States and the other permanent members of the Security Council bear a heavy burden of responsibility. The potential for future UN action will depend greatly on their leadership. And this leadership will need to be exercised responsibly and in such a fashion as to command the support of the wider UN membership. Canada has urged the Council to open up its decision-making process so as to facilitate input by non-members of the Council, particularly troop-contributing nations. I'm pleased to note that the Council is starting to respond to these concerns. We also share the view of a vast majority of member states that the time has come to review the composition of the Security Council. The General Assembly decided last December to create a working group mandated to examine the question of Security Council enlargement. Security Council reform is not going to be an easy process. Many sensitive issues such as the right of veto, the number of non-permanent as well as permanent members, and the voting rules of the Council will inevitably come up in the discussions. The most important objective of any reform should be to ensure that the Council becomes more representative of the current UN membership without losing its ability to act quickly and decisively. Nevertheless, such reform will not overcome all existing problems. There is an increasing recognition that the Council must define much more clearly and carefully the mandates it gives to peacekeeping mission, and it must ensure that the resources necessary to carry them out will be forthcoming. The Council has recognized the dangers of erosion of its credibility and has become more cautious in recent months. To be up to the task, the UN clearly needs a more secure financial basis. As is well known, the UN is having difficulty collecting dues from its member states. Only a handful pay their contributions in full and on time. Canada is one of them, I'm proud to say. Greater efficiency and effectiveness can only go so far in meeting the growing demands on the UN. Money is the lifeblood of peace as well as war. The amounts required are not insignificant, roughly $3 billion a year for peacekeeping operations this year. But they pale in comparison with the amounts spent on defense globally. If member states deprive the UN of a minimum of financial security, they can forget about the many hopes we entertain for the UN's future. The UN will not only need money, it will also need people. Troops, police, and civilian experts, such as election monitors, are in great demand. The demands are so great that it is now impossible to rely, as in the past, on a small number of countries such as Canada, Nordic countries, and a few others to supply all of the expertise required. Indeed, in Canada's case, we currently field some 2,400 military personnel for UN service throughout the world, including over 2,000 in the former Yugoslavia. This represents a very high proportion of our combat troops and clearly a limit for us. The same is true for many other traditional troop contributors. Fortunately, a growing number of countries is willing to participate in UN operations. The UN Transitional Authority in Cambodia involved personnel from over 45 countries from all continents. The UN forces in the former Yugoslavia are drawn from more than 35 member states. However, these troops display varying degrees of training and aptitude to carry out increasingly complex peacekeeping duties, underscoring the importance of improved training. Canada has proposed that the UN consider seriously the creation of a staff college to train officers for peacekeeping duty. Finally, to face up to the challenge, the UN will need to rely on an effective secretariat and a forceful and courageous Secretary General. The new generation of UN operations has revealed many weaknesses in the UN's capacity to organize and manage these vast, complex, and increasingly dangerous operations. There is first a difficulty in finding the required number of troops and to deploy them in a timely fashion. Too often, many months elapse between the time a decision is made to deploy the troops and their arrival in a theater. Troops from less developed countries often lack the necessary equipment or training. While part of the responsibility rests with the member states themselves, the UN needs more efficient systems to accelerate the process. Canada is currently participating in a project to develop a system of standby forces under which troop-contributing nations would undertake to earmark troops for UN service and prepare them for rapid deployment. We've done that in Canada for many years, actually. We are also urging the UN to develop more efficient procurement procedures and examine the feasibility of building up reserves of standard equipment. In addition to the inherent difficulties of making contingents of a large number of countries with different languages, culture, and professional training work efficiently together in an integrated fashion, new problems have arisen because of the reluctance of certain countries to fully accept UN command. There have been many instances of contingents insisting on referring to their national authorities before executing the orders of the UN force commander. The consequences of such challenges to the chain of command can have grave consequences in situations where lives are at risk. While again, part of the problem rests with the member states, there's a need for the UN to reinforce its basic infrastructure, particularly at the New York headquarters, to provide proper command and control. Such elementary support systems like secure communications facilities or round-the-clock situation room have only recently been put in place. I must stress, however, that these shortcomings and difficulties have been recognized and are being vigorously addressed. The UN Department of Peacekeeping has been given additional staff, including a cadre of military personnel headed by Canadian Major General Maurice Berry. I can assure you that the peacekeeping team in New York is impressively competent and dedicated. Mr. Boutros-Ghali has set with great determination to the task of transforming the UN bureaucracy to adjust to future requirements. The reforms he has undertaken are beginning to bear fruit, but there is much to do. The UN must enhance greatly its capacity for early warning to detect the signs of impending conflict before hostilities break out, as well as its ability to practice preventive diplomacy. As well, it must improve its administrative practices and its communications networks. Above all, the UN must learn how to explain itself and its actions in order to foster the support of world public opinion. The factors key to the UN's future success, which I have mentioned, political will of the member states, support of the major powers, financial security, effective bureaucracy, form a complex web. Furthermore, we will continue to face the unexpected, which at any time can threaten the fragile harmony prevailing in New York today. A return to confrontation among permanent members of the Security Council would rapidly result in a reversion to frequent use of the veto and a marginalization of the Council's role. As well, the risks of a widening North-South divide are ever with us. A growing focus on issues of peace and security at the United Nations should not and need not relegate to secondary importance the economic and social problems of the poorest countries. These problems, which are often the root causes of political instability and armed conflict, will continue to call out for international response. And the lessons of interdependence demonstrate that we would ignore these problems at our own risk. For this reason, Canada has strongly supported the call for an agenda for development to complement the agenda for peace presented by the Secretary General in 1992. We will never be short of Cassandras proclaiming the failure of the UN. But those who, like Hammarskjöld, do not wait upon earthly paradise. For them, the first steps towards what became known too hastily as a new world order are hopeful. Canada has established the revitalization of the United Nations as one of its highest foreign policy priorities. As a model member of the UN since its creation in San Francisco nearly 50 years ago, we believe that we have much to contribute to that process. Canadians have not invested heavily in multilateral institutions out of sheer idealism. We believe that these organizations reinforce our security and contribute to our prosperity by protecting us from arbitrary measures and from the use of force by those stronger than ourselves. We have everything to gain from a more effective UN, at last capable of achieving the vision of its founders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. I'd like to call on Professor Culhane.
Thank you, Professor Mandel. That was a very good speech, I thought, and a very interesting one. And these comments are going to be both briefer and more elaboration and perspective than simply criticism. But I do want to take up some of the points that Ambassador Frechette raised. First, if we think about the context in which the UN is operating, we can think about it as a conjuncture of two things. One is the end of the Cold War, that's obvious, but it's like the end of a war. It's like the end of World War II or the end of World War I, in that the whole balance of political forces becomes changed. And the second aspect of our world right now is the collapse of an empire, that is the Soviet Empire. Now, historically, collapses of empires have been associated with conflict because there are scrambles for authority, for political power in those areas which were formerly controlled by the empire. That was true of the collapse, for example, of the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century and of the Austrian Empire in the years before the First World War. So it's not surprising if a period at the end of a war and at the end of an empire, with an empire collapsing, is going to be a period of a good deal of disorder. All that was surprising was that George Bush had the effrontery to talk about a new world order appearing in the wake of it. It reminded me of what Voltaire said about the Holy Roman Empire, that it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. So we shouldn't be surprised that things aren't going as well as one would have thought. It was just jejune of the media and the politicians to sort of assume and make people believe that somehow nirvana had practically come, and therefore when the UN runs into trouble, it must be the UN's fault or somebody else's fault. Now, it's pretty clear that if the UN didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. That is, it's not very well run. It's not an effective organization in a competitive sense. It's been around for a long time, and it's encrusted a lot of organizational baggage with it, including a large number of people who worked for it who were sent out of their countries because they weren't particularly wanted at home. but were high enough status or strong enough politically not to be able to be just ignored. It's a pretty low-class bureaucracy, and that's one of the problems, and Ambassador Frechette has alluded to this in a delicate way. Professors are paid not to be delicate, ambassadors are paid to be delicate.
Do I have a right of reply?
Of course. But it's been very effective in a number of places, and it's very striking that the media almost only reports issues where the UN gets in trouble. That is, you hear very little about, I'll list four of the peacekeeping operations that the ambassador mentioned, or three of them. Mozambique, Namibia, and Cambodia are hardly mentioned. Now, Cambodia was the largest operation, if I'm not mistaken, and it was the one that I, poor pundit that I am, thought was going to be the most dangerous and the least likely to work successly. But you don't see lots of stories in the paper about Cambodia, what a great success it was, and a kind of detailing of it, and therefore it sort of drops out of the public consciousness, whereas the failures, Somalia, a failure of commission, and Haiti, a failure of omission, are trumpeted around a good deal. Now, if we go back to the charter, though, the ambassador said that the charter is a brilliant document. It is a brilliant document, but it omits almost all of what we're talking about. There's no reference to peacekeeping in the charter. There's a chapter 6, which is about mediation, and the image there is of the diplomat going to mediate as a third party between two warring groups. And there's chapter 7, which is peace enforcement, which is the Iraq operation, the only one that was fully chapter 7 operation. Korea in 1950, a partial case. The Soviets had walked out of the Security Council and didn't have the good wit to come back in time to raise their hands yet. But what we have is what Hammarskjöld called, I believe Hammarskjöld dubbed it this, a chapter 6.5. That is a whole set of operations that come in between mediation and peace enforcement. And that's where the opportunities lie, because we rarely have a situation like the Gulf War. And the situations of mediation are a dime a dozen. There are lots of mediators in the world, a large number of them in Cambridge. Can be hired from the Kennedy School, so you don't necessarily need the UN. But the peacekeeping, here you have it. The peacekeeping operation is distinctively a UN operation, and that's where the UN is especially valuable, but it's also where it's tough. So chapter 6.5 is, I think, where the action is. Now, I don't think, in answer to Brian's question, that tinkering is of much value. Organizations always have to tinker. The U.S. aid organization in the 1950s changed its name 4 or 5 times. It wasn't very popular, so it kept changing its name. So organizations always tinker, but typically there's a political problem deep down, which is why they have to keep tinkering, why they're not working well. And that's pretty clear about the UN, it seems to me. The organizational troubles of the UN are not simply organizational. It's not that they can't hire good managers. Is that you have 170-odd states who want their nationals in the UN bureaucracy and who put that often. I'm sure Canada never does this, but most states are willing to put some of their less talented people, but more loyal people, into the Secretariat, and the Secretary General cannot control it. It is not like the head of IBM who can fire people, for example. Secondly, there are political problems on the ground, and these are serious, and they've been mentioned by the ambassador. And thirdly, there are political problems in the donor countries, or in the would-be supporter countries, the United States being the major culprit here. Now, the question then arises, with these political problems, is the UN going to be becoming more interventionist? Will it become more active? Are we going to see a continual growth of UN activity? And I must say I'm somewhat more skeptical about that than I thought I heard Ambassador Frechette being. I'm first less sanguine that UN legitimacy is guaranteed. I don't think the UN can survive very many Somalias, where UN forces kill, 10,000 Somalis in the course of a summer, chasing after and making a hero of a nationalist strongman. I mean, for sheer bad political strategy that goes with the Israelis in Lebanon, the Soviets in Afghanistan, and the U.S. in Vietnam. I mean, the UN's a good company, but there it is. It's not a great performance. And I don't think we can survive too many of those. So I think legitimacy is a little bit more fragile than that. But it seems to me more broadly that when the UN has to use military force, it's failed. I think, if I recall correctly, Merrick Golding said this in that panel we had a month ago. So one has to be careful that one's always walking a line, having enough military force there to make a good show. But if you have to use it, you really have failed. One really has failed. But most fundamentally, though, it seems to me, the political problems lie in the donor countries, in the U.S. especially. I mean, the ambassador was very delicate. She said the U.S. wants to share the burdens. Hell, the U.S. wants to evade the burdens. And that's the Clinton administration policy toward the UN. I don't know why you're waiting for the report. I mean, if the U.S. administration had the courage of its nominal convictions, we would have sent some soldiers into Bosnia after, not before, but after the Sarajevo agreements, which we were so intent on brokering. And there's this cry of pain from the UN ambassador in Sarajevo, the French general, who says we need 10,000 more troops. The French say, with some good reason, look, we already have the largest contingent in Bosnia, and everybody's looking at the Americans, and the Americans aren't looking that direction. So I think it's much more a matter of evasion of burdens than of sharing them, and that's a pretty fundamental problem. So it seems to me that we're not likely to see a great expansion of UN activity unless we get a big change, which we're not seeing in the view of domestic publics in places like the United States toward the United Nations. And the key problem then becomes that humanitarian interventions become all too obvious, require military backing, and can easily, as in Somalia, turn into military intervention. So if military intervention is a failure and is going to cause backlash, then the difficulty is that if you put in a humanitarian intervention, which has political effects, which they always do, the groups, the ID'd-like groups in the locality, will be tempted to try to up the ante, to bluff the UN out, the way the Haitian thugs on the piers bluffed the U.S. out in last October. So it seems to me we could have two scenarios about the UN. The negative scenario is that the UN interventions would be too much emotionally CNN-led. That is, the UN would kind of follow the sporadic pattern of getting involved heavily in something like Somalia, then having its fingers burned and pulling back and not getting involved, for example, in Haiti, where maybe it should have gotten involved. It would be a lot easier. So you could imagine a pattern which was not a rational pattern, which was kind of a reaction to whatever the last problem was. If the last problem was you got in too much, the next time you wouldn't get in no matter what, and vice versa. And that would be, it seems to me, a bad pattern, but politically it would be quite understandable. The positive side, it seems to me, is that the UN would develop some, I think rule book is a good phrase, for selective intervention, where the UN has some leverage. Because I don't think we're going to see a kind of massive increase in intervention and massive increase in support for the UN, because governments, so far at least, don't show themselves willing to do that. So I think we do need a new rule book, and I wanted to remind people that Hammarskjöld had a rule book, and some of those rules are still valuable. I think the rule that the parties should agree explicitly on the UN presence and a need for the UN presence, and agree on the basic outlines of a political settlement beforehand is a very good rule. That the UN is in trouble when it comes in without that, and I think the UN was in trouble in Bosnia without that, and the UN was in trouble in Somalia without it. I think, secondly, and this is harder to specify, that there needs to be a viable political strategy before the UN gets involved heavily. My instinct on this, and I won't claim to be a scholar on it in depth, is that in Cambodia, the UN had a viable political strategy. The Khmer Rouge was cross-pressured in Cambodia. There were elections agreed. The Khmer Rouge could disrupt the elections to some extent. We don't know how well they could have done so, but they could have mounted military attacks on the elections. And this probably would have thrown the election to the Hun Sen government, the Vietnamese-backed government, which they detested. Or they could have sort of laid low, not been very vigorous, themselves not done well in the elections, but had had a chance for the royalists, the Sihanouk group, to win. They were cross-pressured, and they chose, on the whole, seems to have chosen the latter option. And so the UN had a political strategy that wasn't necessarily to sort of bring in force. Compare that with Somalia, where the UN strategy was to go after ID, to make him a hero. He had no choice but either to give up, which he wasn't going to do, or fight back. So it was the political strategies that were so different there, it seems to me, as opposed to the military situation. So I conclude by saying that we definitely need the UN. I don't think we should be hypercritical of it because it's an organization with constraints that are built into its environment and not entirely in its own organizational structure, even though it has problems. But the constraints of burden sharing or burden evasion and the political objectives of states in every given situation are daunting. And the problems are not technical, they are not logistical, and they are not even financial. The financial problem is simply a result of the political problem. It's not the U.S. doesn't have enough money to pay its dues to the UN. The U.S. Congress prefers to keep the UN on a short leash. It's not that $600 million. I mean, after all, the Congress in how many days? 4 days authorized 7.2, or was it? It went up to 9.3 or something billion dollars for the Los Angeles earthquake. When we all know here that those people ought to have to internalize the risks of their own enjoyment of sun, right? I mean, I don't know why we weren't paid for the lack of sun all winter, except they have more electoral votes. But the Californians have a lot more electoral votes than the UN has, infinitely many more. And it wasn't a lack of money, therefore, of sort of 1/15 of the amount we sort of doled out without even thinking about it for the Los Angeles earthquake, or for that matter, roughly 1/1000th of the savings and loan debacle cost to pay our UN dues. It's not a financial problem, it's a political decision and a political problem. And so as long as the UN operates in this political environment, it's going to be both very much needed and very much constrained. Thanks very much.
A brief rejoinder, Madam Ambassador.
I just want to put in a good word for the people of the UN. I did not imply that they were all a bunch of losers who'd been shipped out to New York by their government who wanted to get rid of them. I did not even hint at that. In fact, I hinted the contrary, that there are a lot of extremely good and competent people in the UN who are much maligned around. I'm not saying it's a perfect bureaucracy. I think like all big bureaucracies, it's got its outstanding elements, its average elements, its poor elements. I think it's got problem of getting people from different cultures working efficiently together. But I would not want you to think that the UN bureaucracy is full of second. How do you put it? What was it? Low-class bureaucracy? It would be unfair to a lot of people in the UN. Sorry.
I didn't say all.
Close to.
Contending UN status aside, let's go to some questions. We have about 15 or 20 minutes. I would just ask that you direct your questions directly to one of the panelists, and if we can impose on you briefly just to introduce yourself. So questions are welcome. Yes, sir.
My name is Mark Andler. I'm a GSAS student. I have one question, actually, for both. Madam Ambassador, you made reference to the UN's need for an early warning system. And Professor Cohane, you said something about the UN being able to develop or should develop a rule book for selective intervention. Now, to what degree does the existence of a rule book necessitate UN intervention? That is, if everybody knows that there's a rule book and everybody knows when the UN will intervene, can actors in particular areas draw the UN in if it doesn't act on an ad hoc basis?
I think it depends what you mean by intervention. The intervention is a very loaded word that evokes usually use of force in some fashion, and I tend to agree with the professor when he says that the use of force by the UN has not worked, and I think it hasn't worked not because it's the UN, but because I think in many cases the use of force, unless you apply it massively, was not going to resolve your problem. I mean, Somalia, we haven't, I suppose we could do something about Somalia if we were prepared to put in 300,000 troops for a long time. Same with Bosnia, but it hasn't happened. So when you're talking about a different, if your use of the word intervention refers to other forms of UN action, mediation, all the way to peacekeeping, then I think the temptation is less evident to draw in the UN if it's clear that only in exceptional circumstances would the UN contemplate the use of force, and only then would probably have to delegate it to member states.
Professor Cohen.
I would say the question was a very good one about the rule book. That is, there's always a danger of being manipulated. I think the rule book, though, should indicate under what conditions the UN would consider intervening, and if in one of those conditions should be that the UN has a sufficient consensus and genuine resolution from its major members that its forces aren't easily manipulated, for example, by escalating conflict. So that you maintain tactical flexibility. You don't have a rule book out there that says what you'll do in every situation, but you have a set of principles which guide your involvement in the first place, which one hopes avoid situations where you don't have the conditions. And so you allow some situations not to be dealt with because the organization can't do it effectively.
Good evening. My name is Bernd Matenchik. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School, and I have a question to both of the panelists. You may be aware that the recent upsurge in the activity of the Security Council has not only inspired hope, but also caused some concerns as to the legitimacy of its actions. Professor Cohen has indicated that. You may also be aware that there is presently a case pending before the International Court of Justice between Libya on the one hand, the United States and the United Kingdom on the other hand, involving questions as to the legitimacy of Security Council resolutions. I therefore would like to ask the panelists what need they see for limits to the Security Council powers, what form such limits could take, and whether they see a possibility for judicial review. Thank you.
Well, I think that in world politics, the abuse of power is usually somewhat self-limiting. That is, I don't expect to see a united Security Council continuing in the pattern of the last 5 years very long. You have China, after all, in the Security Council. You have Russia on the Security Council. You have a variety of other countries, and there are different interests. So I think there's a certain amount of self-limiting activity here. There's always a danger for any power, any leading power, the United States in this case, in the flush of victory to go too far, to try to press its policies beyond the limits of the interests and the attitudes of other states. And temporarily that may happen in the wake of the collapse of the opposition, as in the end of wars. But it's not likely to maintain itself very long. I think there's no chance of judicial review of Security Council decisions. We don't operate in a world polity with a secure judicial system, and the World Court is extremely weak and marginal in world politics.
Madam Ambassador.
I would second that, although this is a proposal that comes back every once in a while now in the context of the Security Council reform. We keep hearing that again. I would, in a sense, challenge a bit the assumption that the legitimacy of Council decision is under great strain and under attack. Partly for the reason the professor has mentioned. But also there are checks and balances in the UN system, in the sense that the General Assembly can express its views on Security Council action and can use that channel anytime it wants to pressure the Council. And in fact, every time we talk about the report of the Security Council to the General Assembly, most delegations who talk about the process. The report was too late and it wasn't full enough, but I haven't heard anybody really challenging Security Council decision. And that has to do a little bit with the methods of work of the Council, which have changed quite significantly over the last couple of years, or in fact, the public perception is that the Security Council works behind closed doors, and in fact, the permanent members decide everything among themselves, and that the United States imposes this decision. In fact, on most issues, the members of the Security Council work very, very closely with countries that have a direct interest in the matter. Canada drafts Security Council decisions on Haiti. We are involved at every step of the way in designing the process and molding the Security Council resolution. And I would say this is true for most issues. So there's more intake of the Security Council, by the Security Council, which gives them some more firmer grounding in the mainstream of the membership than the system would seem to sustain.
Thank you. Over here.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Coyles, and I'm a second-year student at the MPP program here. I've been quite concerned, although I don't know, and I'm not an ambassador, and I don't claim to be, but I've been quite concerned with discussions recently about sovereignty and the sovereignty of nations, and at what point in time the UN Security Council can decide to override sovereignty of nations. My specific question is that having grown up watching Star Trek and believing in the concept of a prime directive, in 1994, is there a place for a prime directive? The idea that you've got to let a country or a people develop themselves on their own without imposing views from more developed countries on those regions to really allow them to grow and achieve their full potential.
If you're arguing for the strictest interpretation of national sovereignty, that every country has the right to do what it wants inside its own border, including committing genocide on its own people, this concept has never existed, ever. And it's not, and if there's anything, the trend is going against that. All the conventions that countries accept means that they signed, it means that you relinquish a little bit of your sovereignty. All the Human Rights Convention means you are accountable to the world community for your own actions. So I don't think that having some common standards and a will to work collectively means that you're not allowing countries to develop and find their own way.
It's important to be clear on what sovereignty means and what it doesn't mean. Sovereignty shouldn't be equated with autonomy, because sovereign states are never fully autonomous, and some small sovereign states are very non-autonomous. And we should distinguish between formal sovereignty, which all states have, very few exceptions, such as Iraq under UN quasi-rule as a result of its aggression, and what I call operational sovereignty, which is legal freedom of action. And the ambassador is quite right. Governments, in order to cooperate internationally, deliberately give up certain elements of their operational sovereignty while maintaining full formal sovereignty. Canada is a sovereign state in a full formal sense, but has lots of agreements and is therefore obliged by international law to limit its autonomy, its autonomous freedom of action in a variety of ways. Now, I think the problem with the word in your question, which is problematical, is people. Because if it were the case that each country were actually run by its people, then there'd be very little reason to interfere with sovereignty. But you said, shouldn't we let people work out their own destiny? Well, what happens when the Khmer Rouge is murdering a large part of the Cambodian people? Or what happens when Saddam Hussein, having attacked a neighbor, is also trying to eradicate a large part of his people? Now, that's where the tough problem comes in, and it doesn't. And you have to, the proper way to put it is, sovereignty would say that anybody who happens to be running a country, that is full absolute sovereignty, would say, anyone who happens to be running a country and who has the de jure and de facto authority has the right to do whatever he and his group of people want to do. And I think that notion is changing, I think, and I think it should change. My own view is that it's going to change pretty slowly, because the commitment on the part of the world community, I think, is going to be limited to the kinds of activities that a full implementation of humanitarian intervention or human rights would require. So I wouldn't be worried about sovereignty disappearing. I don't think that's going to be one of the world's most serious problems.
I should add that this is not a north-south issue either. You put the question in terms of allowing developing countries to develop in their own rights. You are assuming that this debate over sovereignty is one that divides that has proponents of on the one hand. In the UN, that's not this way. And in fact, you will have many developing countries who are the strongest proponent of vigorous action by the UN to prevent, for instance, abuse of human rights, or indeed humanitarian intervention. There was tremendous support for the ill-fated Somalia operation. But at the time, the biggest support came from Africa, where they said, you've got to do something. These people are dying of hunger. Please come in. And yes, it is legitimate that you should use force. We went about it the wrong way. I think we underestimated the problem. Some countries wanted to go in and get out as quickly as possible. But, so what I'm trying to say is it's not a black and white nor south issue either.
It's an interesting problem because if you think about the Soviet bloc before 1989, between the Helsinki Accords, where the Soviets promised certain actions that they were not intending to take to put into effect about liberalization of internal policies, and they found themselves kind of caught by their promises. They defended a notion of absolute sovereignty. It's nobody else's business what we do to our dissidents, whereas it was the internal dissidents, the liberals inside Eastern Europe, who were using this little sliver of break in the sovereignty front to start Charter 77, to start Solidarity, to use that little space they were given by Helsinki. So very often it's certain people, at least, certain often brave and democratic people in a society who are benefiting from these little chinks in sovereignty as opposed to the leadership. That I think is also true in much of Latin America.
Thank you. We're here.
Yes, Calypso Nicolaidis, Kennedy School. Both of you have argued against CNN, or alluded against CNN-led intervention, but I would like to hear you speak a little bit more about the role of public opinion in this question of legitimacy of intervention, and above all, maybe play devil's advocate and propose that the prominence of public opinion and of visibility by public opinion of an issue is the kind of factor that will make a threat by the international community and by the UN credible. The fact that public opinion reacts to something ties the hand of a state that make a threat, because of course they'll be made ridiculous if they don't act. And one can argue that in the case of the Sarajevo bombing, you can see it as NATO reacting to public opinion, but you can also see it as NATO seeing the fact that public opinion, high sensitivity to the issue at that point made it clear that the hands of the states were tied, so that in this case, public opinion helps the intervention of CNN and the Western media actually play a very high role in raising the credibility of threats. So if you take that into account, how would you start to see a sort of alliance between the CNN and the UN?
Which of you want to?
I think
Madam
what you said
Ambassador.
is absolutely true. That actions by governments and by governments to the UN will have all the more credibility if there's the backing of public opinion behind them. I think it makes threats, for instance, very credible if there's a sense that there's full support by public opinion. But public opinion only acts on things that it knows about. There are thousands of people who are dying every day in other parts of the world that the public opinion knows nothing about. Therefore, it plays no role in shaping policy on Sudan, for instance. And that's why if you base your policy only on CNN, you will, I think, skew your. You will end up focusing only on the crisis that are on TV screens, and I don't think that meets standards of equity or fairness for a world organization that has to be equally concerned about all parts of the world, not the one that only make it to CNN.
One can also ask Calypso, what kind of intervention a public opinion-led policy yields? Because public opinion is very fickle. Look at U.S. opinion on Somalia. The demands to go in when the photographs were of starving people, and 18 Rangers are killed, and there's this huge outcry to leave, which was carried out. So public opinion itself is incredible. That's one of the problems. If you're a politician and you know that it might take 6 months or a year to do something, and you're being pressed by the public to do it, but you're quite aware that maybe in a month or two that same public, with no sense of responsibility, will be demanding that you get out, or else that you resign or lose authority or popularity because of your action, you'll be very cautious. So I think that's a fundamental problem with public opinion. So you may well find that American public opinion, for example, tends to like bombing. Americans like bombing, and they don't like sending ground troops places. Now, sometimes it may be that a credible threat of bombing is the best policy. Well, I've not been an advocate of ground troops in Sarajevo until there was some agreement. But it's not always going to be the best policy, and yet there'll be a bias in a public opinion-led policy towards certain kinds of actions, not because they're most effective, but because they resonate with the public's view of the world.
Thank you. Walid?
Good evening. My name is Walid Chamoun. I'm a research associate here at the Kennedy School. And its involvement in the Middle East, the United Nations has shown a pattern of failure consistently. And the case that comes to my mind is the Israeli conflict, Israeli-Lebanese conflict in southern Lebanon, and the involvement there. Often you see Israeli defense forces running over United Nations positions and checkpoints. And I've done some research on that. I found that there isn't much respect in Israel for the United Nations as an institution. My question is, would somebody be able to explain to me why there isn't such a respect?
Well, because the UN was never designed, and is never possible to be designed, to take forcible action against a major military power which has the support of a member of the Security Council. That was ruled out by the Charter. The Charter says that only the Security Council can take peace enforcement action, and it can only do so with the consent of all 5 members. So the UN founders deliberately said that if you got the UN into a situation where it's in between 2 strong antagonists, no international organization is strong enough to stand up to that. So there's never been an expectation that the UN would be successful in that kind of situation, and there's no reason to believe it ever would be. That's just the nature of world politics. And it's not the failure of the United Nations, that's the way world politics is. It's not a very nice place much of the time, and it's not a place where you can always be effective.
Can I add, I think there was a second part to your question, which is why is Israel so reluctant to see the UN becoming involved?
To respect it, yeah.
You're looking at 45 years of history there, maybe not 45, was close to, where there were periods where there were a number of initiatives and resolutions passed by the General Assembly, which Israel felt were hostile to it, what it stood for. And for a long, long time, Israel was treated as a pariah within the UN, and therefore, it's going to take a little time for the confidence to be rebuilt. I can see signs of it every day now. There's a warming of relations between the UN and Israel that reflects the beginning of a peace process, where I think there will be a bigger and bigger role for the UN in the years to come. I would not say, however, that it is a failure of the UN if it is not at the center of the peace process or any other peace process. I don't think we should expect that the UN will always be the main actor in any kind of peace process, and if for some miracle some other peace process develops outside of the UN, it's a failure. I think it would be absurd. I think any route, any mechanism has to be tried. It so happens that the Middle East, in view of its history, the UN was not the best place to broker this peace agreement.
Yeah, but the UN has voted to partition Palestine, and the UN has taken actions against Iraq and has enforced international law. I don't see why it should not be done in some other places, like in southern Lebanon.
Back to the first answer you got.
Yeah.
You'll find that the UN has passed resolutions that both sides find anathema in the Middle East, and both sides have refused to abide by UN resolutions of various types. And that's simply a reflection that this is, until now, and we hope it's going to change, been such a zero-sum game, such a competition, that there's almost nothing, you could propose almost nothing that both sides would agree to. And And that's a function of the nature of the conflict and the fundamental attitudes on both sides, and not of the UN's failure.
Okay, thanks very much. Over here.
Hi, I'm Ricardo Suarez. I'm a junior here at the college. With all due respect to Canadian nationalism and one of Professor Cohane's book, I think the United States is still pretty much of a hegemonic presence in the inter-American system. So with the economic integration of the Western Hemisphere and the growing regionalization of international affairs, I wonder if you see the role of regional organizations, specifically the OAS, as a more effective mediator of international affairs. I mean, specifically, do you see the UN as becoming less and less of a factor in the growing years and regional organizations becoming more important?
It is entirely a function of the ability of the regional organization to, if you're talking about the peace and security area, to manage it themselves. I think the charter under Chapter 8 makes it not only legitimate but absolutely desirable that regional organizations should be the first one to try to resolve conflicts in their region. Mind you, sometimes the nature of the conflict is such that the regional players are too intimate, they have too much at stake, and are sometimes not the best mediators, and that would tend to push back the conflict to the UN. I think the OAS, to talk about this hemisphere, is going through a real revival. I'd like to think, not modestly, that the entry of Canada into the OAS has made a difference and has helped to, I think the timing was particularly propitious because of the political changes in Latin America, changes of attitude in Washington. And I think our entry into the organization has served as a catalyst. This organization, I think, has real potential to become the primary focus of cooperation and conflict management in the region. But it's not there yet. For instance, the OAS is not equipped to, would not be equipped to launch a peacekeeping mission. But it's doing some very good work in election observation, for instance, and mediation and other things.
Oh, no comment. Last question over here.
My name is Gabriela Ramos. I'm a student at the Kennedy School here. And my question is related to these new international issues that are in the agenda of the United Nations, in particular, the promotion of democracy. I know that there was a proposal of creating like a high commissioner that was in charge of elections, supervisions, and promoting democracy in some countries. I don't know, where is this debate and where is your opinion about the United Nations taking participation in this kind of issues that were usually related to the states?
Well, when it comes to observation of election, the UN has observed something like 100. It's a growth industry of the UN. Every country comes to the UN to have its election observed. I think what the challenge it's facing is to make sure that it doesn't get engaged in processes that are not that don't give the basic guarantees of seriousness. But this is an accepted fact now, and the UN has the infrastructure to do it, and it's very much.
My concern is more with the organization of the elections and the sponsor elections. I mean, what they do in IT or what they can do in other countries, just not go in there and observe and qualify the elections, because we know that's
Well, it depends on the situations. Where help is required to actually organize the election, the UN is capable of doing that. Where the requirement is more for giving legitimacy to the election and helping to bring confidence in the result on the basis of technically correct election, the UN can do that too. It has done a very wide range of activities in that area. The biggest one will be in South Africa, of course, where you will have thousands of observers from the UN, many of which are already there because they're involved in observing and assisting in the campaign all the way up to the election day. So in fact, in a few years, the UN has developed quite a sophisticated range of services and support that it can offer. As for the position you were referring to, you may be referring to the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is a position that was just created at the last General Assembly, which should help to raise the profile of human rights in the UN in a way that we haven't seen before. Defense of democracy being, I think, one of well, political rights being part of human rights.
I just want to point out that this question and the question earlier about sovereignty are, in a sense, the converse of each other. That is, if you promote democracy, you are impinging on sovereignty. If you defend sovereignty adamantly, then you may be blocking out observers, for example, or blocking out democracy. So just a plea to think about the trade-offs involved here, and not to sort of pick on slogans, because if one had a slogan of democracy plus sovereignty, that would be a contradiction probably in many places of the world.
Thanks very much. On behalf of the Canada Club and the Institute of Politics, I would like to thank Her Excellency Ambassador Louise Frechette for traveling all the way from New York to speak to us today, and Professors Robert Cohen and Brian Mandel. Thanks very much.
You must come back to academia and get out of the real world. It's a dangerous place to be.
The list of countries who are most attached to sovereignty.
Yes.
I think some people would be horrified to know that it's Iran and Syria and
Yes,
Myanmar.
exactly.
They're the ones that defend sovereignty. Hello, Alistair. How are you doing?
No problem. It's happened. I'm tired, Chief. I find 15 hours a day of this. I think of that job that you had back in that wicked job when it was only 18 hours a day. This kind of rest.
Thanks very much, Professor.